So towards the tail end of 2016, I'd finally decided to dip my feet into single-player games. I wanted to find out what were the stories that were being told through games, and it led me to the Uncharted series, which were made by Naughty Dog, and I absolutely loved the games. The gameplay, the action, the character writing, and the dialogue was absolutely phenomenal, and the stories they told were really enjoyable to play through. And over time, I also became aware of their other game, which by many was considered to be the best game on the PlayStation 3 console, and that was The Last of Us. Now, this game was a completely different style to Uncharted, being much more dark and gritty, and a much more serious tone to it, while still playing to all of Naughty Dog's strengths. But for me, this game wasn't one that I gelled with when I first played through it. For the most part, people will often say you only get one chance at first impression, but this is one of the few games which had a much more lasting impression when I've played it through again. And so today I'll be covering all of my thoughts on this game, the gameplay, the story, and the amazing adventure that you experience whilst playing The Last of Us. So, as usual, we'll get some brief housekeeping out of the way. There will be spoilers discussed in this video. I would normally add in graphics and segments to tell you when that's going to happen, but given that this game is more than 10 years old and has now had 2 remasters, I think we can be adults and decide that if you haven't played through this game and want to just not watch this particular video. Now, as I said in the introduction, I didn't get on with this game when I first played through it. I definitely appreciated it. The character writing, yet again, was fantastic. The gameplay was a lot more challenging than Uncharted. The shooting mechanics, they felt a little bit more tricky, especially with the idle sway that the weapons had, but it also felt completely authentic to the game. These weren't super soldiers, these weren't superheroes, these were average people that were having to fight their way through this zombie apocalypse that came from nowhere. And the aspects of survival and looting for supplies, so you could create equipment that could try and help you, whether it be medical kits, fire bombs, trip mines, and all sorts of other equipment. It added in those small survival aspects, and again, it kind of added to the experience because it did come across that these were otherwise ordinary people that were having to live in this sort of hellscape of a world, which was transformed by the outbreak of the cordyceps. And in turn, the storytelling was a lot more dark. There was certainly a lot more abrupt and almost traumatic cutscenes in this game, which, when I first played it through, didn't sit with me. It wasn't that I couldn't appreciate that they were good and they were very well written and very well acted out by the talent of this game. It was just the fact that at that point for me, I wasn't really willing to explore these sort of feelings. I wasn't really willing to explore the sort of dark side of zombie survival, I guess. I was much more happy with stuff like Uncharted, where it was generally a very upbeat tone. It was kind of silly and comical, and whilst it did have certain bits of character development, but very rarely went into sort of darker character concepts, whereas this game very much explored that. But then, as I've gone back and replayed the game, I've started to appreciate it a lot more. It's so perfectly executed in the way it's directed and written in so many ways, that whilst it does feel almost slightly traumatic to experience some of the cutscenes and some of the parts of the story, you also can't help but feel engrossed and wanting to find out what's going to happen next. How does this affect the characters and how does this change their relationships? It really just adds to the whole experience of this game. You start out with the outbreak of the virus, where Joel's trying to escape with Sarah and Tommy, and unfortunately in the process of escaping, she gets shot by a soldier. And the sudden cut to black and the introduction of the Last of Us theme and the opening titles, it was just so abrupt and sudden. It was probably one of the most unexpected starts to a game I could have imagined. But it was just so perfect at intriguing you. It was horrific to watch in some ways, but equally well it was engrossing, because you'd already, even in the space of 15 minutes, formed somewhat of an emotional attachment to these characters, and you could kind of empathise with Joel's pain at this point. The game then skips forwards by 20 years, with very little time elapsed for the player from seeing Joel lose Sarah, and that perfectly represents his struggles as a character. As you start to go further through the game, you get introduced to Tess and Ellie, and the tug-of-war for Joel, where Ellie is a payday, but then also is becoming a responsibility, but also for him very painfully reminds him of the daughter he lost. And the way that was directed, by having the very abrupt cut where you've got Joel losing Sarah, and then the opening sequence, and then getting into that story where he meets Ellie and then has to start trying to take her across the entire United States to maybe find a cure for the cordyceps. it very much represents his pain. He's obviously spent many years trying to hide it, but it's still there. And that's what the player is experiencing because of the direction of the game. And it's moments like this, which are just so well directed and so well crafted into a story, that you can really build empathy for these characters, even if you've had no experiences that match up to what they're going through in this game world. And the way the story develops and introduces new characters, each character they introduce gets enough time that you can get their motivations, you can get where they're coming from, and whether you like them or not, they feel like a very flushed out character, and whether they be a protagonist or an antagonist, they fit really well. You've got the introduction of Sam and Henry, which was leading up to such a wholesome bond between the four characters, until yet again another very abrupt climax to their story leaves the player feeling almost traumatized. But equally well, you can't deny how flawless the performance was. Playing through the Uncharted games, I got used to fantastic character writing, dialogue and acting by the talent of the game. But in The Last of Us, because you've got that extra emotional weight behind the storytelling, and it is that much more darker, you feel more connected to the characters. The revelations within the story are just that much more shocking and have that much more emotional weight in the game. And once again, it's a sudden cut to black before the next chapter of the game opens. Yet again, the trauma is still there for the player, and it represents how the characters of Joel and Ellie are actually experiencing it and dealing with it or not dealing with it in some cases. You then got the reintroduction of Joel's brother Tommy, and how their relationship has changed over time, and Joel's starting to realise that Ellie isn't just a payday he can just throw away. He does actually feel responsible for her, and has actually grown to enjoy her company, even though she still does remind him of his daughter. And you start to see them growing a bit closer, up until the university sequence, where all of a sudden Joel is left on death's doorstep and Ellie is stuck alone trying to survive and potentially save him. Again, a really sudden change in the direction of the story, and it means that the segment of the game where you're then playing as Ellie when you're alone and just trying to survive made it that much more engrossing, because you have that connection with her. You realise the pain that her character is feeling because of the events at the university, but you also, as a player, want to know what happened to Joel. Is he still alive? What's going to happen throughout the rest of the story? It just keeps making you want to find out more and want to keep playing, and it's just so fantastically put together. And ultimately, the writing and direction style means that you are at no point doubting whether the character really would have done that. You're at no point thinking, that doesn't seem right for this person. It makes perfect sense. It flows exactly with how this story has been unfolding. And it just makes the climax of the game fit perfectly within the story they've been creating. And the ending, whilst confusing to me the first time I played through, was excellent at leaving it perfectly open to player interpretation. And the culmination of Joel seeing Ellie now as a responsibility and wanting to do what he felt was best for her well-being. But this is glossing over the central antagonist of the game, which is the Cordyceps virus, which creates the infected enemies you have to fight your way through throughout the entirety of the game. Whilst there weren't many different enemy types, the variety between them was fantastic. And their introduction was pretty spectacular. The first time you encounter clickers was pretty darn terrifying, and the bloater as well, trying to work out how to actually kill it, was pretty difficult the first few times I played through the game. And then you get sections like the hotel where you're trying to restart the power in the basement and get to the emergency room before all the infected catch you, was terrifying the first time I did it. And whilst the game was still linear, just like the Uncharted games, it still felt completely engrossing. I never found myself bored going through any of the combat sequences. And once again, it then links into the sort of survival aspects where you're trying to find supplies and create equipment. Because especially on the hardest difficulties in this game, you have to choose whether you're going to fire that arrow to try and take out that clicker, or risk it aggroing and start charging at you, at which point you've got nothing you can do to defend yourself against it. And it becomes a much more survival-focused game. But on any difficulty you play, it's a very satisfying and enjoyable game to play through. It is terrifying at times, and that's what's great about it. It just fits perfectly with the theme of the game, and it was just fantastic. The weapon mechanics and variety were also fantastic, and once again, it just adds to what was otherwise a fantastic game that it was building. And overall, the game, as I go back and play it, is fantastic. It feels like it hasn't aged a day. The only difference you see now is that, yes, it is left behind in visual quality, which I think is part of the reason for the second remaster of this game, The Last of Us Part 1. Now, personally, I haven't picked that up. The main reason is I've got The Last of Us Remastered. I don't really want to pay for it again. It's not going to change the game for me. But I do agree with some of the principles behind it, especially because the sequel they made had loads and loads more accessibility features. The first game was difficult. A lot of players will struggle with it, especially if you don't play many games. It can be almost impossible for some people to work out how to get through the game. But the accessibility options that they added with the sequel were fantastic. You had so many different colorblind options. You could even change how the enemies behaved if you were really struggling and you wanted to make it so that they wouldn't get aggressive until you got very close to them. And it's those sort of settings that I completely understand The Last of Us Part 1 being made. To add those features in, give it another graphical overhaul, I'm absolutely fine with. But for me personally as a player, it won't change how the game is. The original game is still one of the best stories ever told in a game. It is still a fantastic game to play through, regardless of which version you play. And so for that reason, I will still stick with the one I've got. It's not to say that the game isn't worth buying twice, but there are definitely smarter uses of money at the moment. And for that which I did spend on this game, it was 100% worthwhile. It's been fantastic to play through. It still grips me no matter how many times I play it. Just the character writing and dialogue and direction is just flawless. It's one of those things you can play it as many times as you like, and it will still pull at your heartstrings, and it will still engross you into the world it's created. And it's fantastic. And it's why the game has the reputation it does, because it is one of the best games made, and it is one of the best stories made. It was just flawless in almost every way. Some people might not like the style of very linear games, but you cannot deny the things this game does right, and how they create an amazing world and are just a fantastic experience to play through. So this, along with a lot of the games I've so far covered in this series, is one that I'm just so happy to have gone back and played through. It's a joy to play through, and it's been fun to make these videos on it as well. So if you do have any thoughts on this game, you are more than welcome to leave those in the comment section down below. And if you have enjoyed the video, do also feel free to like and subscribe if you would like to see the rest of this series. Anyway, I've been the guy with no gamer tag, and I'll see you on another video.